Earlier this month, I attended the Reason rally with some friends. They were the real reason I attended. It was cool to hear a speech from Bill Nye and see Penn Jillette, and I even walked within about 8 feet of James Randi and greeted him as he made his way onto the stage. He returned the greeting with a smile and a wave of his walking cane. That man is a class act. For the most part, however, I took the trip to DC to do two things: spend some time with friends I don't get to see in person that often, and to indulge in some obviously non-productive but fun verbal arguments with the theists who felt passionately enough about their religion to protest the event. There's plenty more to say about that, but maybe that's a topic for another video. One of those theists this year happened to be Ray Comfort, and he's one that I want to focus on for now. You see, Ray was filming some footage for some new movie, and he had lots of minions walking through the Reason Rally's crowd, handing out propaganda for the event. It was advertised to draw a crowd, stating things like, "Come see Ray Comfort get thrown to the atheist lions." He was billeting this as some event there where he was going to be sorely outnumbered by a crowd of angry atheists fighting the good fight through the power of Christ. In reality, Ray had a cohort of people with him doing all of the physical labor, setting things up, carrying equipment, and so forth. It was interesting watching him direct people around and even bark a couple of gruff orders outside of his extremely friendly, wholesome Christian shtick. Of course, that came right back when the cameras were rolling. He had two boxes and two microphones set up so that he could stand on one box and talk to someone else who was standing on the other, both into their microphones. For a brief moment, I had a chance to step on that box opposite of Ray Comfort, but I didn't. I allowed a friend, who I consider far superior to me in debate prowess, to step on that box instead. Now, he was, however, rather weary from his trip and a night without sleep prior, and he was also put at a massive disadvantage by some other factors. For one, Ray's editing crew is sure to have a field day chopping up their exchange to manipulate the conversation to sound however he wants it to. And Ray also spoke to him for maybe the first 5 to 8 minutes before tagging someone else in, who then tagged someone else in. It was a live debate of attrition with a 3v1 advantage for the Christians who were going to edit it to sound however they wanted it to sound anyway. And as if that weren't enough, they also gave themselves the ability to live edit the conversation. They did this with a button on the box where Ray and his tag team partners were standing. Anytime the atheist speaker started to make a point or pressure them in any way they didn't like, they simply stepped on that button and muted the non-believer's microphone. Way to courageously throw yourself to the lions, Ray. Now, I did a video addressing Ray's tired old script years ago. It's linked in the description if you're interested. Basically, he gives this absurd "are you a good person" test by asking things like, "Have you ever told a lie?" When a person honestly admits to having told at least one lie at any point in life, he follows it up with another question: "What do you call a person who lies?" That's the kind of disingenuous nonsense you're dealing with here. Having told a lie doesn't make you someone who lies as if you do it regularly. Having stolen something once doesn't make you someone who steals things of consequence regularly. But that's how he frames these questions, to guilt theists into feeling bad and in need of God's forgiveness, through him, of course. And in the case of non-believers, the effort seems to be an attempt to get them to admit to being bad people without God. He's also trying desperately to set them up for this absolutist thinking that needs to be accepted in order to take on his more recent presuppositional nonsense. See, if you're unfamiliar with it, presuppositionalists win the argument in their own minds and those of people who already agree with them by presupposing that God exists and that the people who argue against that claim also know that God exists, even if they won't admit it, or even if it's not something that they consciously accept. They then dance through a bunch of convoluted setups and gotcha questions to really force you into accepting these absolute terms so that you can accept their position of absolute morality. By the way, Ray's not so good at these kind of word games yet, so this is the point where he likes to tag someone else in to do it for him. The presup angle involves getting someone to admit that they can't be absolutely certain of anything, and therefore we need some absolute source of guidance to provide absolute certainty on matters of right or wrong. It is contingent on people accepting objective morality. Well, I know people who believe morality to be objective, who don't believe in God. The presuppers will insist that you need an ultimate creator in order to supply us with objective morality, because again, we humans are all liars, thieves, etc., remember? They'll ask you how you know your own reasoning is valid in an attempt to showcase that you use reasoning to determine that. they'll call that circular logic when really it's just a circular question that only works if you insist that your reasoning is 100% infallible 100% of the time. Of course, that's usually not your position, but they don't really care what your actual position is. If you're like me and you consider morality to be subjective, they'll try another angle. They'll pick something atrocious like rape or the Holocaust and ask if it's objectively wrong. If you try to explain to them that, well, they're obviously functionally wrong in society, people have been able to morally justify them to themselves, either due to mental defects, personal trauma, misinformation, etc. So even if the rapist believes he was justified in raping someone, we still lock him up because society has to make things as objective as we functionally can. When you try to explain this to them, they argue you as if you're claiming that societies invent absolute morality, and therefore you must think that a majority of people have the power to determine something like the Holocaust to be objectively and absolutely morally right. Again, that's because they need you to operate in absolute terms in order for their presuppositional arguments to operate. Of course, this forces them to argue a position you don't hold, but they tend to ignore that and constantly try to bait you back into terms of absolutism and pure certainty. At that point, you know you're wasting your time trying to convince them of anything or even converse with somebody who has no interest in what your real position is. If you find yourself in a debate with someone like this, my advice is first to find out if they really take themselves seriously or if they're just playing word games to appeal to people who already agree with them. The vast majority of theists, including preachers, don't tend to rely on semantic word games like this. And people that are trying to have a one-on-one conversation with you to explain why they believe in God also don't tend to rely on presuppositional tactics. It's only something that I've seen done in crowds or on shows in front of lots of people where there's a big audience. I don't know that anybody uses this as a sincere method to explain themselves to somebody, but they might, I suppose. So personally, I have a lot more respect for someone who can just admit that they believe something without empirical evidence, especially if they don't try to convince me or expect me to believe it based on that lack of evidence. But if you really think that somebody's having an argument with you and they're sincere and they think this is the best way to convince you of their belief or explain their belief to you, then I suggest you focus on explaining to them things like why absolute objective morality from a single source wrapped up in a bow for us may be highly convenient. They aren't representative of the complexities that we find in reality. Sometimes two sides are right for different reasons. Sometimes both sides are wrong for different reasons. Sometimes there are many shades of one issue, with each shade being right and wrong for different reasons. And even if the Bible were the true word of a real God, it wouldn't be able to help us sort out which shade is best for each of us. Speaking of which, even if you grant the presuppositionalists all of the premises they need to accept that we don't really know anything for sure and therefore we must accept that God exists, they still haven't done anything to prove why it's their particular God that's out of thousands proposed who exists, or why their particular interpretation of their particular holy book is accurate, despite the fact that thousands of other interpretations, even of that one holy book, have been proposed. See what I mean by reality being a little too complex for their liking?